The Whitmore estate gleamed like something out of a magazine spread, all polished marble, gold trim, and towering crystal chandeliers that bathed the ballroom in a warm, opulent glow. Outside, a line of black luxury sedans purred in the circular driveway, delivering a parade of the city's most influential people, bankers, CEOs, politicians, and socialites draped in silks and diamonds. Inside, waiters in white gloves glided between the clusters of guests, balancing trays of champagne flutes that caught the light like prisms. At the far end of the room, elevated on a small stage beneath an arch of roses and soft candlelight, sat a glossy ebony grand piano. It was there that Harland Whitmore, the man of the hour, chose to make his entrance, not from the grand staircase like a host greeting his guests, but from behind the piano, his presence timed to draw every gaze at once. Harland, tall and broad-shouldered in a perfectly tailored midnight blue tuxedo, gave a slow, knowing smile as the crowd parted to watch him settle onto the piano bench. His fingers, adorned with a gold signet ring, rested lightly on the keys before springing into motion, coaxing out the delicate opening notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. The music floated through the hall, mingling with the faint scent of roses and expensive perfume, casting a spell over the murmuring crowd. Women tilted their heads, closing their eyes to savor the romance of it. Men leaned forward, their expressions caught somewhere between admiration and envy. Harland played not just with skill, but with the practiced flourish of a man who knew he was being watched, every keystroke a statement of elegance, control, and superiority. Against the far wall, half hidden near a set of double doors leading to the service corridor, Samuel wiped down the marble with a soft cloth, his dark work shirt rolled at the sleeves. The faint strains of Chopin reached him, and for a moment his hand stilled on the mop handle, his head tilting slightly as though some long-buried memory stirred. But then he returned to his work, methodically polishing the floor, while guests nearby stepped aside with the unconscious ease of people avoiding a shadow they didn't notice. The final notes of the nocturne shimmered in the air before dissolving into silence, and for a heartbeat, no one moved. Then came the applause, loud, rolling, and tinged with the kind of awe reserved for someone who had just reminded an entire room why he was the man they all wanted to know. Harland rose, gave a small bow, and flashed that same charming smile that had closed countless business deals. He soaked in the adulation, every clap feeding the quiet certainty that he had once again proven himself untouchable. In the corner, Samuel bent to pick up his cleaning supplies, invisible in the golden light, his eyes following Harland for just a second longer before disappearing into the service hallway. The applause still lingered like the aftertaste of fine wine when Harland stepped forward, one hand resting casually on the gleaming edge of the grand piano. His eyes swept the crowd, catching nods of approval and the indulgent smiles of men who saw in him a reflection of their own ambitions. "Ah," he began, his voice warm but carrying the practiced resonance of a man who knew how to command a room. "There's nothing like Chopin to remind us of refinement in a world that so often forgets it." A ripple of agreement passed through the guests, gentle laughter here, a murmured so true there. Harland let the moment breathe, then added, "You know, my friends, I've always believed music reveals the soul and the measure of a man." He paused, letting his gaze linger on his daughter, Clarissa, who stood off to the side in an emerald gown, her beauty tempered by a quiet reserve that contrasted sharply with her father's theatrical confidence. "In fact," Harland continued with a faint smirk, "I would say this. If there's a man alive who can play Chopin with the same elegance, precision, and depth as I have tonight," he held up one finger, a dramatic pause hanging in the air, "I will gladly give him my daughter's hand in marriage." A sharp intake of breath rippled through the crowd, followed by a chorus of indulgent chuckles from the men and a few raised eyebrows from the women. Clarissa's cheeks flushed, and she lowered her eyes, a polite but tense smile frozen on her lips. Harland waved a dismissive hand toward her, as though the statement were merely part of an elaborate performance. Half jest, half challenge. "Of course," he added with a chuckle, "such a man would have to exist first. And I'm afraid that in all my years, I've met precious few who could even begin to approach that level of artistry." Around the room, Guests exchanged knowing looks. Many assumed the boast was as safe as a bet could be, for who among them, or certainly among the staff, could match the CEO's well-practiced performance? In the corner, near the service door, Samuel paused mid-step with his mop, the faintest crease forming between his brows. His eyes shifted toward the piano, the soft gleam of the instrument catching in his gaze like a spark in the dark. Harland, oblivious to the silent audience he had just gained, took a sip of champagne and basked in the ripple of amusement his words had created. To him, the challenge was a flourish, an indulgent line in the ongoing play of his life, where he was always the lead actor, certain the script would never betray him. But somewhere, beneath the layers of laughter and crystal clinking, a different story had just begun to write itself. The laughter was still drifting through the air when a voice, low but steady, cut across the space between the crystal chandeliers and the polished marble floor. "Would that offer apply to anyone here, sir?" It was not loud, but the weight in the tone seemed to still the clinking of glasses and hush the murmurs. Harlan's head turned toward the sound, his brows lifting in faint surprise. Standing near the edge of the service hallway, mop bucket at his side, Samuel met the CEO's gaze without flinching. His posture was unassuming, his dark work shirt slightly damp at the cuffs, but there was something in his eyes, a calm, steady flame, that seemed to draw the attention of every person within earshot. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, exchanging incredulous glances, as if they weren't entirely sure they had heard correctly. Harland chuckled, a sound edged with condescension. "My dear man," he said, projecting his voice so all could hear, "I was, of course, speaking in the spirit of friendly competition among peers. Not," he gestured vaguely toward Samuel with the stem of his champagne glass. Among the staff, a few polite titters rolled through the crowd, but they faltered when Samuel took a step forward, his eyes never leaving Harland's. "With respect, sir," Samuel said, evenly, "I thought you were speaking about music, not status." A faint tightening passed across Harland's jaw, the kind that only someone watching closely would notice. The guests around them formed a loose circle, sensing something unusual was unfolding. One of those rare moments where the invisible lines of hierarchy blurred just enough for the unexpected to slip through. Clarissa, standing slightly behind her father, looked from Samuel to Harland, her expression unreadable, but her attention fixed. Harland, unwilling to let the moment escape without reasserting control, gave a theatrical sigh and set down his glass. "Very well," he said with exaggerated magnanimity. "If you wish to step into the spotlight, who am I to deny you? By all means, Mr. Samuel," came the reply. "Samuel Brooks." Harland nodded, waving toward the piano with the flourish of a man indulging a harmless diversion. "Then, Mr. Brooks, let us see what you can do." After all, his smile widened sharp and bright. Chopin does not forgive mediocrity. The crowd murmured, a soft current of anticipation running through the room as Samuel stepped forward, setting his mop and bucket aside. He walked toward the piano without haste, his pace measured, his face unreadable. The light caught the curve of the instrument's black lacquer as he reached it, placing his hands on the polished wood for just a second before pulling out the bench. The air in the room shifted, still watchful, as he lowered himself into the seat, his fingers brushing the keys with a familiarity that seemed at odds with the plainness of his uniform. Harland leaned back slightly, his arms folded, certain this would be a brief and amusing interlude. But Samuel's eyes, fixed for a moment on the ivory keys, held a focus so deep it was as if the rest of the room had vanished. For a heartbeat, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the chandelier lights and the distant hiss of champagne being poured in some corner. Samuel's fingers hovered over the keys, his eyes half closed as if listening for a note no one else could hear. Then, without fanfare, he began to play. Not with the cautious stiffness of someone proving a point, but with the unhurried grace of a man speaking in his first language. The opening bars of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor spilled into the air, each note shaped with an intimacy and precision that made the piano itself seem alive beneath his touch. Conversations died mid-sentence, glasses were lowered, and even the waiters froze in place. Samuel's hands moved with an effortless fluidity, coaxing shadows and light from music, weaving passages that swelled with aching tenderness before plunging into storms of furious energy. His body swayed slightly, not in performance for the crowd, but in communion with the music itself, as though he had forgotten anyone else was there. By the time the melody reached its aching, suspended phrases, a kind of hush had settled over the ballroom. Different from polite listening, heavier, more reverent. Clarissa's eyes were wide, her lips parted, her gaze fixed on Samuel as if she were hearing the piece for the first time. Harland, arms still crossed, had stopped smirking. His expression was unreadable, though the faint tension in his shoulders betrayed that he was no longer entirely comfortable. The music surged, Samuel's left hand pounding the lower register with controlled power while his right hand danced over the higher notes, cascading like falling glass. Then came the final sweeping passage, notes tumbling, clashing, resolving, before fading into a last lingering chord that seemed to hang in the air like a held breath. When it finally released, the silence that followed was so complete that the faint ticking of a distant clock could be heard. No one moved. Then, slowly, as if waking from a spell, the crowd began to applaud, not the polite clapping reserved for social obligations, but the kind of applause that starts in the chest and breaks free in a rush, genuine and unrestrained. Some even stood, their faces still carrying the stunned softness of people who had been unexpectedly moved. Samuel didn't bow, didn't even smile. He simply removed his hands from the keys and folded them in his lap, his gaze calm and steady. Harland's throat tightened as he tried to summon words, but the edges of his pride had been nicked by something deeper than mere technical skill. There had been life in Samuel's playing, raw, unguarded life, and in its presence Harland's own performance felt suddenly hollow. The last echoes of applause faded, replaced by a charged silence that felt almost heavier than the music itself. Harland cleared his throat, attempting to summon back his confident host's demeanor, but his voice emerged thinner than intended. "Impressive, Mr. Brooks," he said, each word weighed down by a careful neutrality that couldn't quite mask his unease. "Tell me, where does a janitor learn to play like that?" His tone carried a faint edge, the kind that invites the crowd to share in the disbelief. Samuel met his gaze steadily, unflinching, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the room. "My mother was a music teacher," he began. "She taught in a small town that didn't have much, certainly not the kind of piano you have here. But she had an old upright that was more keys of chipped with an ivory. I started on that when I was 4. By the time I was 12, I was playing in the church on Sundays and winning state competitions." A murmur rippled through the guests. Some leaned forward, drawn in by the unexpected intimacy of his words. "I was offered a scholarship to the conservatory," Samuel continued, his gaze shifting momentarily to the piano as if it were an old friend. "But before I could take it, my father passed away. My mother got sick soon after. Medical bills piled up. So, instead of studying music, I worked. Grocery stores, construction, cleaning offices at night. And now," his hand gestured faintly toward the mop and bucket still sitting at the edge of the room. "Here." Clarissa's breath caught. She had been raised in rooms like this, where music was a luxury to be enjoyed between courses, not a lifeline someone clung to in the dark. The crowd was no longer smirking. If anything, some looked faintly uncomfortable, as though the floor beneath them had shifted. Harland, however, forced a polite smile. "A tragic story," he said, his voice dipped in a false sympathy that didn't quite hide the brittle undertone. "But of course, tragedy doesn't necessarily make an artist." Samuel's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in a quiet recognition of what the man before him truly was. "No," he agreed softly, "but living does. And I've lived enough to know Chopin isn't just about playing the notes. It's about carrying something you can't put into words." For a long moment, no one spoke. Somewhere, a cork popped faintly, but it felt absurdly out of place. Clarissa stepped forward, her gaze fixed on Samuel. There was no pity in her eyes, only a strange mix of respect and something softer, something almost protective. Harlan's jaw tightened at the sight, a subtle shift that did not go unnoticed by those closest to him. What had begun as a show of dominance was beginning to turn, and though Harland would never admit it aloud, a part of him felt the first prick of fear. The room's atmosphere had shifted so subtly that Harland didn't notice it at first. How the air seemed heavier, the guests quieter, the laughter that once flowed so easily now replaced with a low, uneasy hum. Clarissa stepped forward, her gown brushing softly against the marble floor, the emerald fabric catching the light as she moved. She stopped just a few feet from Samuel, her gaze steady and unwavering. "Father," she said, her voice clear but calm, "your challenge was made before this entire room. You said you would give my hand to the man who could play Chopin as well as you, or better. I think we both know Samuel has done that." A stir passed through the crowd, some guests glancing at Harland with an almost predatory curiosity, eager to see how the man who always controlled the stage would handle being cornered. Harland forced a laugh, but it sounded brittle, almost sharp. "Clarissa, you misunderstand. It was a playful remark, not a legal contract. Surely you don't expect me to honor your own word," she interrupted gently, the softness in her tone making the challenge sting all the more. Harland's eyes narrowed, the mask of charm slipping for a fraction of a second before he smoothed it back into place. "This is absurd," he said, glancing toward the guests as though seeking their silent agreement. But their faces offered no rescue, only polite detachment, some tinged with intrigue. Samuel stood silent, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, refusing to either retreat or provoke. Clarissa took a slow breath, her voice now carrying a different weight. "You've spent your life telling me to look for strength, character, and truth in man. I've seen more of all three in Samuel's playing tonight than in any of the men you've paraded before me in suits and titles." Harland's jaw tightened, the words landing heavier than he expected. A few guests shifted, clearly uncomfortable, as if they were witnessing something too personal for the setting. Clarissa's eyes softened as she turned to Samuel. "You didn't come here to prove anything, did you?" Samuel shook his head slightly. "No, I came to work. The music was just there, waiting." The simplicity of it seemed to disarm her more than any grand speech could have. Harland stepped forward then, his voice hardening. "Enough. This is my house, my event, and my daughter's future we're talking about. I won't have it turned into a spectacle." But the moment he finished, the truth was already clear. He had lost control of the room. His challenge, meant as a casual display of superiority, had become a mirror reflecting back not Samuel's place in life, but Harland's own vanity. Clarissa looked at her father for a long moment, then said quietly, "Sometimes, Father, the spectacle isn't in what you plan, it's in what you reveal." A stillness settled over the ballroom, the kind that comes when everyone senses the ending of a story but doesn't yet know which way it will fall. Harland stood at the center, his jaw clenched, eyes darting between his daughter and the janitor who had dared to step into his world. The guests waited, a ring of polished shoes and glittering gowns surrounding the silent confrontation. Clarissa's words still hung in the air, their truth pressing into Harland's pride like a slow, steady blade. He could feel the judgment of the room, not overt, not hostile, but quietly damning. For a man like him, that was worse. His first instinct was to dismiss Samuel entirely, to laugh it off, to reclaim control with the ease of long habit. But when his eyes met Samuel's, something stopped him. There was no arrogance there, no smug victory, only a calm steadiness that unnerved him more than defiance would have. It was the look of a man who knew himself, who didn't need anyone's permission to exist as he was. Harland glanced at his daughter and found the same steadiness reflected in her gaze. He realized with a sudden, almost physical jolt that he could either crush this moment and keep her loyalty through obedience or let it stand and risk losing the careful control he had built over her life. But the control was already slipping. "Mr. Brooks," Harland said finally, his voice quieter than the crowd expected, "you play well, better than I anticipated." A murmur ran through the room. Was this concession or merely the setup for a final insult? Harland continued, each word deliberate. I will not pretend that I'm ready to hand my daughter's future to a man I barely know. But I can admit when I've underestimated someone. You've earned that much. The crowd's murmuring deepened. It wasn't the marriage offer his earlier boast had promised, but it was as close to humility as anyone had ever seen from him. Clarissa gave the faintest nod, not in gratitude for the words themselves, but for the fact that he had spoken them at all. Samuel inclined his head slightly. That's all I came for, he said simply. Harland's brow furrowed, as if trying to decipher whether it was a veiled challenge or the truth. Samuel turned to leave, retrieving his mop and bucket, his exit as unhurried as his entrance had been. As the crowd began to stir again, their voices rising in low conversation, Clarissa moved to follow him. Harland watched her go, an unfamiliar heaviness settling in his chest. He had not lost her, not yet, but something in her had shifted tonight, and he knew it would not shift back. Outside, Samuel stepped into the cool night air, the city lights reflecting faintly in his eyes. He had played for no prize, fought for no title, but in the quiet of his own heart, he knew he had won the only thing worth winning, his dignity untouched.